I'm going to start off by saying this is not going to be as long as the first version I recorded, nor is it going to be as long as probably, well, the second version I recorded. And I say this because it is now 1 a.m. on the 19th of March, and the very lady who I am supposed to be taking the day off because it's Mother's Day for will be slightly annoyed with me because I'll be coming in so late and waking up all the dogs. However, YouTube and the computer between them have managed to eat two versions of this video. Or rather, my perfectionism demolished the first one, and the second one managed to corrupt so much on uploading to YouTube that frankly it was never going to go fly. So, this is going to be a conciser version of the Battle of Yamen. So, hence tonight's viewing is probably going to be less than an hour. But in good news, I will hopefully be still alive to give you a live on Thursday and chat away with you. Also, I have cut out the section which was going to announce what the the special patron choice this month was going to be. But don't worry, I'll announce that on Tuesday. In a long patrol on Tuesday. It's been a fun day. It's been an interesting one. So, I think before we start talking about Battle, we've got to talk about roughly three things. One, this is the dictionary I have, which is called a Chinese Biographical Dictionary by Herbert Allen Giles. Now, what it's interesting for is the romanticization of the Chinese names. It uses the earlier version of the romanticization. So, by romanticization, we do not consider that it was not dressing up the names in beautiful flowers and singing them songs of love and poetry and fealty and all those things. No, we mean trying to turn the Chinese language into something which can be written in romanized letters. What we tend to use when writing. And the phonics of it has changed over the years, as people have, to an extent, our version of English and our spoken phraseology has changed, but also our understanding of the Chinese linguistics has changed and evolved and got better. So, with that in mind, I will warn you that some of the names are in the older style romanticizing, and some are in the newer style. And basically, the differential is I was fairly sure of who I was talking about in the older one, but in the newer one, they've managed to add so many names which look exactly the same that frankly I was going, It's also the reality that some of the key people who get mentioned in this book and this book and this book do not have Wikipedia pages. And there is one thing Wikipedia is very good for. One thing it's very good for. You can't, as an academic, use it as a reference guide because you don't know who wrote it. You have to spend too much time digging around to find out who wrote it, and even then you can't be quite sure that's the person they say they are. And you can't use it for, therefore, guaranteed research. But you can use it for a quick, what's the name of something? Because usually it has the many different versions of names, especially of people, in a nice little stream next to them. It's brilliant. It makes your life spectacular. But some of the people we're talking about do not have Wikipedia pages. That's fine. That's history. the vast majority of people do not have Wikipedia pages. It's sad, but it's also realistic. However, this means we have to be to an extent sure of who we're talking about. So, if I need to be sure of who I'm talking about, then the first thing where I can be sure is by making sure I'm using the name which is attached to the story, to the history. Even if that is the old romanticization. Because here is the other disturbing bit of history when it comes to the knowledge of the Chinese. Some of the older books out there are published by not esteemed historians. They're published by people who lived in China for years, and they are retelling the histories as have been told to them by the people there. And they are wonderfully colourful and probably accurate. But there goes through a small period in about the, I would say, late 50s, 60s to the early, actually even the late 70s, where because they weren't academics, because their methodology of history gathering was talking to people, they were looked down on. And there was almost an eschewment in the history of avoiding them. And presuming anything they wrote must be wrong. More recently, when you read works like this is of course the Cambridge History of China. I have far too many volumes of this book, of this series. It's far too expensive, but it's good. Or even books like this, The Making of the Song Dynasty, which is, I would say, of the two, the far easier to approach if you're just looking for an introduction to Song Dynasty. You start to realise that more recent academic work and more recent historical analysis has found that those stories were true. Those histories were true. And they are as colourful. And if we've managed to verify 60%, there is a good probability on the remaining 40%, in my opinion. Mostly, I would say, though, and this is always what sprung into my mind, is the people producing these books aren't doing it for money. Most of them have plenty of money. Most of them were posted to China for years for work or just interest, really. And they are producing a book in many ways because they are writing down something to share with their friends. And you have to remember, their friends are the sort of people who go to the club and have long conversations debating history. Okay, there are many things of the club era of British national history which are not great, but please allow me a moment to fantasize over that sort of scenario, being able to go and have long debates in luxurious leather chairs with, they wouldn't serve iron brew, would they? They'd be serving scotch. I can dream of iron brew next to fires and discussing with the great luminaries of the day in an intimate setting. It just sounds fantastic. Yes, I know, there's a lot of other bad stuff with it, okay? Please accept that. I do realise it, but the fantasy is okay for a couple. Fantasy dream is okay for about a couple of seconds. It's a nice place to dream. I've got YouTube and chatting to all you. That is my equivalent. I do need to oil the chair, though. The point is, these books are great. And they've given me a history point to start off from. And I'm going to start talking about the whole Song Dynasty in this work based on that and give you some of the stories through the Song Dynasty because of that. Because the Battle of Yamen is the end of the Song Dynasty. And it is unfair in any scenario to concentrate on just the end. Yes, the way something ends can tell us that it failed. But if all you take from any piece of history is success or failure, then you have failed to learn many of the lessons available. Because both success and failure can teach us. When you succeed, you should always ask, what did you do right? What did you do wrong? When you fail, you should always ask, what did you do right and what did you do wrong? But more importantly in both, you should also, as well as asking those questions of yourself, ask those questions of what you were up against. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? You need to always ask those questions to be able to learn from history. Now, starting off straight away with the phonics and the romanticization, we have song versus sung. This book says song. This one says sung. This one has a third spelling in it. Okay? This is a very basic problem, and one of the interesting things you come up when you're studying history and trying to learn from wider sources than just your own culture. And one of the reasons why it's so funny to me whenever I see people who are outside historical departments and universities going, you need to teach broader history than just X, Y, Z, and usually it's go, you're just teaching the history of English-speaking nations. If we as academics and historians can't even decide on what name we're using, anglicised, romanticised English sort of name we're using for a foreign dynasty, how in the name of all things are we going to get our students to study it properly? They will try. We will run the courses. But they're not going to be courses as in-depth as they could be because they're going to spend half their life trying to figure out, hang on, is the Song Dynasty the same as the Sung Dynasty? And then you have the fact that the Song and Sung Dynasty divides into Northern and Southern Song, and then you just have even more fun. Okay, it's just wonderful. But let's leave that all to one side. Prior to the rise of the Song Dynasty, you have an absolutely terrible period for China. And this is going to sound like I'm overstating it, but I'm not. You have what is known as the period of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. It's fun. Even more fun, you have the fact that most of the conquering and most of the stuff which forms the Song Dynasty and the Song China is actually done by the Zhao Dynasty, or the House of Zhao. However, Emperor Taizu of Zong, the first Song, is the senior general of the Zhao. And the emperor dies. And he has children. But they are child emperors. And there's going to be a theme in this, a small problem for China in this sort of period as a history. And please note, I'm using China to cover the whole area because it just seems fairer to do so. Not China as in the state, China as in the region. And please note, I'm not including the Tibetan region and all those things in it. I'm not, because they are part of it, but also culturally, that it's just a minefield, and I don't want to get into it because I know there are many modern political issues as well, which are put up on top tons of historical cultural issues. And as said, this is going to be a shorter video. This is not going to be the really long one I did originally, which was 2.5 hours, and I didn't like it. Because, honestly, it was not enough on the Songs dynasty and their history, and I'm trying to explain so much of the context of what was going on around it, and what was going... I wasn't actually getting into that. So... But if this video does well, and if you like it, I might do more videos, and I might break out even more of my copies of this, and work through them for you. Now, the Song come to power, and they basically end the warring. Zhao had done most of the work, but Song, senior general of them, takes over. I'll be explaining that in a second in more details, because it fits more with the military problem, which I've got to talk about next. But it's worthwhile thinking about the Song China and its shape. It's not the modern China in shape. As you can see, we are talking about a very sort of different territory. Now, the Northern Song, when that existed, there was this is at its greatest extent in 1111. Usually, sometimes called Anno Domini, sometimes called Common Era. Either way, they both mean roughly the same thing when we're using that particular dating system. So this is 50 odd years into the Song dynasty. No, 150 years into the Song dynasty, sorry. It's 100 years, it's a century. You know, in history terms, that's nothing. And about 160, 70 years before they're gone. So that's about halfway through. At this point, the Song are massive. When they start off, they're the Northern Song, capital in Bianjing, which is now Kaifeng. When they go down to the southern capital, their capital is Linan, which is of course now Hangzhou. They do provide a lot of stability. This is the important thing. Just the name of the previous period, 5 dynasties, 10 kingdoms, tells you everything you need to know about what's going on there. It makes every single civil war and internecine strife you've seen in European histories or retold in the various ways it's been, including of course the modern Game of Thrones, where they take some knowledge from it, look like a startup. The size of the armies involved. A few years ago, I think Total War was the Total War game series was rumored to be doing something about China. I'm not sure if it ever got published. It might have skipped me by somehow. And it was all going to be on that period because it is such a rich period of military actions and developments. But after this, the Song come to power, and they want to push in the stability, progress. They want to make things work out and make things move. And they have to solve a lot of problems, and some of these problems are solved by the creation of banknotes and a permanent standing navy. A sort of one. Yay! This is why I like them. This is why I'm interested in them. This is why I would never claim to be a China history specialist. There are people who are far more qualified than me, but I am a China history enthusiast. I love going and I apply the same skills to Chinese history as I do to all other areas of history, and I try and learn as best I can within the limitations that my reading of Mandarin is absolutely atrocious, so I depend upon the things which have been translated to English texts. It's getting better, but honestly, I would say I have restaurant menu Mandarin rather than reading Mandarin at the precise moment, because that's where my strength lies. Now, also this was supported by a GDP, and that's gross domestic product, which is by some sources estimated to have been 3 times larger than that of Europe's in the 12th century, i.e. the equivalent time. Now, please note I'm using the phrase estimation because there are incredibly interesting things which get chucked around in both the European estimates of GDP at a time, because no one is doing really the necessary data gathering, so it's all estimations, and it's estimations based on estimations put together by different methodologies. And whilst China does actually have something of an actual bureaucratic system which is taking some details in, which allows us to estimate it from far more uniformly, they do have some issues for us when it comes to cross-estimating them because of the way their accountancy system works. So, 3 times larger than that of Europe's, I'm not sure. But I do know the population is larger, is a lot bigger. And per capita, I think probably is about the same, so it's going to be bigger. How much bigger? Is interesting. Before someone says, well, there are these great cities which are very, very rich. There are. There are also great cities, might not have the same population, because they don't have as many people, but which are per capita as rich in Europe. The thing is, there are also areas of great poverty. There are subsistence areas. And again, the Song actually are very good at pushing the growth of infrastructure and food. Their whole dynasty does seem to have a real understanding of the necessity that if you feed people who are hungry tend to be more likely to be content. People who are content are less likely to rebel. Yeah. It comes back to the same advice given by, I presume, many of my family's forebears when advising their young people how to start investing. There are 3 things humanity always needs: food in their belly, clothes on their back, and a roof on over their head. And honestly, their priority in that scenario is going to depend on how hungry and how wet they are. But, that's why invest in those 3 things. You might not make massive profits, but you'll always make something. And if you're a government and you secure those 3 things for your populace, they tend to be happy. These days, add in energy, but there again, considering we use energy to cook food, to heat our homes, make our clothes, all those things, I'd say that probably still comes under those category of 3. Now, during the Northern Song, the census recorded 20 million households with a population of roughly 90 million. So that was when they controlled just the northern part, and that's the Song Empire at that point. This is the Song Empire when it's first really founded. As you can see, the number of empires, number of problems have already dropped down. Now, the other really interesting thing about this empire is the attempts to shift, not ships. Goodness knows, how many times have I done that and not noticed that one? Shift. Well, of course I wrote ships because I'm a naval historian and I was thinking ships. But I always think in ship. But it's shift. It's shift. Yes. Done. Shift from a military aristocratic elite to a scholar bureaucratic elite. Now, this is partially to stop there being a rise in so many overmighty generals that you repeat what the previous cycle. Because the previous cycle, the dynasties and the kingdoms had been created by overmighty generals. Generals who were so powerful that the emperor could not control them, that no one could control them. So you still need to run an empire. You still need to run a huge population. So you need to offset that power. But you have to do it in a very careful way. And one of the interesting things with Song China, and I'm going to use Song because all my graphs have Song on them. All the graphics seem to have Song. There is this constant tension because they need a strong military. They need a very capable and strong military because they have massive threats. You know, this lovely map where it goes Tibetans, Dalai, Divet, they're lovely. What it carefully misses off is what would be at the top. Would be the Mongols. And, you know, you have these lovely, lovely threats all around you. And you have internal issues, of course, with generals. If one gets too powerful and gets annoying, you need to have other generals who can go and deal with them. So you need a large and capable military. Your military is also going to be useful for tax collection, policing, all the other things that you're going to need those personnel for. Security. Security. A lot of security. But you need to try and counterbalance it. And the scenario would sort of point to is some of the similar issues you went through with decolonization. Because, as I've discussed before in this channel with decolonization, because of the way the colonizers had run the countries that they colonized. Please note, this is the point. The institutions which had been most developed tended to be the security and the military. So, justice system tended to have the police and the jails, not necessarily the judges and the magistrates, the police and the jails tended to be well developed, and the military, because again, those are the tools which the colonizer uses. And so, when the colonizer goes, who are the most well-trained people who are used to being in charge of things? The police and the military. And as important as they are, and you're never going to get a naval historian saying they're not important, they're not critical. If you do, they're a strange naval historian. Those are not good things to be overmighty. But you also need them strong enough that you can use them, and they're going to be viable for protecting you. So it's a balancing act. The Song seek to counterbalance them by a cultural growth in Confucianism and sponsoring and encouraging that, but more importantly, producing this scholar bureaucratic elite, people who will be running and able administrators, but who will owe their entire position and their safety to the emperor. But, in another twist, will only qualify by passing very rigorous, very difficult examinations, which ensures they are able to do the role, but also, more importantly, gives them some sort of standing with the military, because they're not. The military will go, well, you know, we're training, we're trained, we're fighters, we're warriors. What have you done to earn your post? You just got the emperor's favour. No, I've had to pass a very difficult exam, so I can be allowed to do this role. And I have to do this role to a certain standard, otherwise I won't be in this role. It gives you a bit of standing when you're dealing with the soldiers. So here is the military problem, and I've got a lovely picture here to go for it, but this explains quite a lot of the military problem. 960, Zen and Deng prefectures reported by express courier that Liu Xing'an in Taiwan had joined the Khitan and invaded across the border, and so Taizu was ordered to lead a large force on a northern expedition against them. The next day, the palace attendant, Zhan Duran, held a farewell banquet for the departing army on the outskirts of the city. At the time, there were many rumours in the capital of a plan to make the Inspector General, i.e. Taizu, the son of heaven, a emperor. When the soldiers reached Chen Bridge post station, they deliberated and together decided to support Taizu. The next day, as they assembled at the post station gate, suddenly all the officers came together and said, "We brave death in battle 1,000 times to defeat the enemies of the state, but the son of heaven is now a small child. Let's first make the Inspector General the son of heaven, and then proceed on the northern expedition." Because he had consumed much food and drink at the farewell banquet, Taizu was sleeping drunk in his chamber, and so was unaware of their plans. Next morning, the soldiers, with sword drawn, pounded on the bedroom door, and together they dragged him out into the main hall, where they clothed him in a yellow robe. The officers saluted him and said, "We soldiers have no ruler. We wish to make you the son of heaven." Then they shouted out the rounds of long life to the emperor, and the sound could be heard for miles around. Taizu cursed them, but they would not relent. They crowded around Taizu, put him on a horse, and headed back to the capital. But Taizu drew up his range and said to the officers, "I have accepted an order to proceed north, but you have decided to support me. If I issue an order, will you obey?" And they all said, "We await your order." Then Taizu said, "I have served the Empress and His Highness loyally. The court officials are my colleagues. Do not violate the palace or disturb the officials. These days, when rulers raise troops against the city, they allow troops to loot and pillage. Do not sack the city nor loot its treasury. If you follow my orders, I will richly reward you. If you disobey, I will execute all of you." The officers saluted and received his order, and strict formations, they entered the gate of benevolence and harmony. That's lovely. Please note, I am, in true British way, completely sarcastic and sceptical about that particular story. It's very good way. It's very good optics. Say, I didn't want this job. I was drunk. I didn't realise that my soldiers were coming in to take me to make me emperor. While they were making all these decisions, I was indisposed. I was drunk and sleeping soundly. And they decided to spontaneously make me emperor because of the situation we're in. I chose to serve them. That is why I must now be emperor sitting on the throne in the palace. Come on. Good general, a very good general like he was, knew exactly what was going on. And probably orchestrated it. Or at least made sure the people who would orchestrate it and do it were in the right place and were good at their jobs. Anyway. Military expenditure consumed 80% of the Song government's revenue. Oh, sugar. So, you have, this is how they get power, because one of the generals is raised up by his soldiers, and then you have the fact that they have to spend 80% of their revenue on the military. That's going to make the military pretty powerful, so it kind of counterbalances what I said here. There, when people go, oh, they tried, they made it very much, they took it away from the power of the military. The military expenditures consuming 80% of their budget. In the nicest way, people can protest these days about spending 2% and all sorts of percentages of GDP on defence. Imagine if the government was spending 80% of its budget on defence. They'd be absolutely rocked. Imagine what wouldn't also be getting done. Now, in the first years of the Southern Song, for example, the expenditure on the army reached a roughly 9.6 million strings of cash per year, a figure which climbed further when the Song intensified their armament in subsequent years. That comes from the Cambridge History of China, page 458. They've taken it from another book, which I can't find my copy of at the moment, but I'm going to probably just get an extra copy, because I think I've loaned it out to a student. I'll get it back at some point, but it's the sort of book you need, and it's called China's History as Maritime Sea Power. The trouble is, if you're spending this much money on defense and on your military, then every time you're trying to make economies and save money, where are you going to have to look? You're going to have to look at the military budget. It's 80% of your budget. Where are you going to look? But you have a problem. Your options for reducing its cost will either make it less viable as a military force, in which case your neighbours are pretty darn skilled and will come in and take you out, or you empower basically generals and you turn them into the very thing which you were scared of, and which were what caused the previous trouble in China. It's an absolute catch-22, because you start off with a system whereby you rotate the battalions and you rotate the commanders from the northern areas to the palace to, so you can have the central, and they're rotating on every 3 years. They're rotating round between the various positions, back, and so they spend 3 years in a place and then they'll come back. And they'll spend 3 years there and then they'll go out. And you're rotating the commanders around and everything. And that's great, but it's also expensive. It stops the troops becoming too attached to any particular area. It stops the commanders becoming too powerful in any particular area, because they get moved back and given a new command where they have to start assembling everything all over again. Keeps them all loyal, but boy does it cost money. If you're currently looking at the current militaries which most Western nations use, you'll notice there tends to be a cycle of roughly 3 years in a post and then move on. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's as little as 18 months in a post and then move on. Long enough to be viable in post, short enough not to potentially create problems. It works. And also, that then adds credence to the thing of when you start talking about people who are in post for a long time, how powerful they do get. You know, when I talk about Sergei Gorshkov, and people go, well, I'm not sure if he had the power really to do that, you know. By that point, is he a figurehead or is he this or that? He's been in power for a long, long time. He doesn't just know where the bodies are buried. He knows where the bodies buried by the people before you, before the people before you, are buried. It gives them all sorts of levers they can pull, which other people just don't have. And this is the reality of it for China. And this is the reality of it for Song China. They have a lot of threats, and they have to try and keep their military viable. You can create an army of entirely militia. You can put everything down to local groups and have, well, all sorts of troops all round, basically local militias all over the place. And they're wonderful. They'll provide you with lots of numbers cheaply. But they're not going to train, and they're not going to be available as viably as professional soldiers. And that's your constant struggle. It's versus having a professional, viable army which you can use to fight people like the Mongols, to fight your enemies. But you need that number, you need enough mass. And it's always a question of which one should you have more of. Then we get on to building a navy, and that's even more expensive. Now, please note, I'm going to have a little bit of about this, the Mario map, but it's one of the most interesting pieces of historical cartography there is, because it's from 1460, so it's from roughly 170 years later. So people, you can quite likely go, well, hang on, Alex, these pictures, these can't be the ships of the Navy they're building at the time. And you're sort of right, but also, if we consider the progress of sailing ships and their development in European theatres, and we think of how long ships of the line, etc., stay around, and they grow bigger, their shapes evolve, etc., but, there is similarity there of the lines going on for centuries. It gives us an idea. It gives us an idea. And there are some really interesting passages. Again, I have to admit, each of these paragraphs come from different pages. The first paragraph comes from page 454. Second paragraph comes from page 456. And the third paragraph comes from 458. When Hu Qing was sent as an envoy to Korea during the reign of Emperor Hu Sung, reigning 1100 to 1126, 2 more large sacred ships were built at Mingchao. They probably had a displacement of over 1,100 tons. After the Ning era, shipyards also were established in Mingchao and Wenchu. In 1090, these 2 shipyards were ordered to construct 600 ships annually. Furthermore, yards in Lingxi and the circuit of Hunan received orders to build 300 ships. In 1136, the expenses of the Office of the Control and Organization of Coast Areas, which had the control over naval bases and fleets in the circuits of Huntong, Lingxi, and sometimes Fuxin, came up to 2,000 ounces liang of silver, 2,000 strings of cash, 100 bales of silk, and regular allotments of rice, plus the status, grade, and salary of the staff members, which were equivalent to those of fiscal commissioners. Shun Yoshi. They're investing a huge amount. One of the interesting things is you got the sheer number of ships being built, and you have reports of exercises of ships of 700 ships exercising. And it's no small fleet being produced. So, where are these ships? Well, that's the really interesting thing. And the really interesting thing is if they're building these volume of ships, how long they're going to last. Well, we know again from our knowledge of ships of the period and wood knowledge, a knowledge of woodworking and wooden shipbuilding gets fairly advanced in various places around the world. There is a lot of information being exchanged. This from 1460 shows how much information is going around the world. This is produced by someone who is a monk. He never leaves Venice. Yet manages to get all the information put together to produce these. So information is flowing. So we know that if a ship is built of seasoned wood, then it can usually serve 20 to 30 years, depending on how heavily it's used. This is the Frau Marot map, as I'll talk about that in a second. If it's built of unseasoned wood, maybe do a decade. I have a distinct feeling from when I read the sources and the descriptions given that the vast majority of the ships are built from unseasoned wood. Which is probably sensible, and certainly pretty darn viable for the Chinese, considering how much of their fleet work was probably riverine work in fresh water. When its scenario is probably going to maybe even last longer than would it in salt water. Could well add another 5 years onto that, and again, when you're serving in areas like rivers, etc., your craft become to an extent expendable because they are going to bash into things more often. They are going to get bashed into more often. They're going to take more damage. You're going to probably need to replace them every 10 to 15 years anyway. So building a vessel which has a longer life than that is frankly absurd. And to an extent, if you're already building a large number of vessels on that scale, why build your smaller ocean-going vessels differently? Because you might as well build them the same. It's not it's just a question of scale, and once you're already building at that scale, it makes sense. But for my money, if I was building something the size of a sacred ship of 1100 tons, that's supposed to go across the sea, or something like the later vessels of Zheng He, I would be thinking seasoned wood would be involved, and there is some sort of program like you have going on in Britain around the Royal Dockyards, where the wood is being collected and being seasoned appropriately and stored for the time. They certainly have the bureaucratic and organisational capacity to do that. It's just, if you're doing that for 600 ships a year, and you're doing it out of seasoned wood, honestly, the expense would be even greater than that suggests. Because when those stats come up and those facts and figures come up, you can see some of the figures being put in, and they are compared to the military budget, the budget for the army. It would be a lot more money if it was seasoned wood for everything. It would be. Think of it. It's not just the storage, it's the whole timeline. You add on seasoning, and suddenly you're not getting the wood for this year, you're getting the wood for 5 years' time. So you've already got to have a store of 5 years' wood before you even start a 5-year storage of wood, for the next 5 years before you even start. And then what does that get you? An extra 5, an extra 15 years, maybe? But if your ship's bashed up, you're just going to rebuild it anyway. And for the Chinese, the sheer number and quantity they're building, where's the value in it? The value for Britain in doing the seasoning and all the effort they do is because of the size of Britain. That's the value because Britain is a lot smaller than China is. It's able to get the most out of its productivity by doing the seasoning, because that means the ships last for longer. The ships are used mostly in open waters, at sea. They're not going to get as bashed as often. Yeah, it makes sense. You can basically, if you double the life expectancy of the hull, you double the number of vessels you can have available at any one time for the same amount of wood and same amount of production. Which makes sense when you're that size. But they have many reasons for building a navy, and please note, they're putting this investment in, it's mostly being put in to deal with piracy, but also to deal with some of their neighbours. If we go back to this particular scenario, the Southern Tang and the Southern Han are especially interesting from a naval perspective, and the Wu were also interesting from a naval perspective, and that's why they maintain navies. It was also useful for dealing with the Mongols. It allowed them to go round them and counterbalance them on several occasions. This is the Frau Mauro map. This beautiful piece of art, cartography though, is made by Frau Mauro, and it is a wonderful bit of information produced for the rulers of Venice and Portugal, and by bringing together all the information to be got from their various navigators and their merchants going around the world, they put this all together, and it's got all, like I've shown here, all these little ships on it all over the place, showing you what the ships look like in the regions they are. And if you're looking at going, well, that looks like a funny mixture of the world, well, if you consider this is the Mediterranean here, you can see Spain, you can see Britain, Ireland, you can see North Scandinavia, the Baltics, and this all the way down here is Africa. Then we've got the Red Sea, and all over here Asia. It's actually fairly good, but the south is the north and the north is the south, and the east is sitting, well, in the east, but it's different. Well, the west is in the east and the east is in the west. It's differently orientated, but that's actually the right orientation for the drawing, if you read the writing. So it's a really interesting piece of history, and in the navigation video I've got coming up, I will talk more about it. So key personalities for what is arguably one of the largest battles ever fought, let alone one of the largest naval battles. When you are talking about 200,000 people being involved on one side, mostly non-combatant court officials and servants, on up to, well, probably a little over 1,000 ships, mostly transport ships, but there are warships as escorts, and probably tens of thousands of soldiers included in that capacity, and at least probably closer to 100 warships on the other side, and at least 20,000 soldiers on the other side. You're dealing with a huge number of people. You have, for the Kublai clan, you have Zhang Hongfan, who is a distant relative of Zhang Shiji. Now, Zhang Shiji was the commander of Song forces. He had originally started out serving in the Mongol forces. Yes, because they'd already taken over large parts of China by this point, and they had Chinese serving in them. Now, he had had some issue, had left Mongol service, and had gone and done the necessary examinations, necessary service, and was serving in the Song. A very good general serving in the Song. And a very loyal general serving in the Song. There's a very interesting thing about after the battle is whether or not he dies in a storm or all sorts of other things, but I don't think he does. I think it seems to me it's a very neat way of tying things up. Oh, they died at sea. I think possibly he took his remaining people and got away. And I'm not sure where he went, but he'd already left the Mongols once to go and seek someone else who needed his help. I wouldn't put it past him doing it a second time, while he still had strength in his body to do so. He just seems that sort of character to me. He reminds me of the stories of one of my about 4 great-grandparent, who was a very interesting soul similarly. Then we have the Song Secretary of State, Liu Xiufu, which I am absolutely sure needs to be re-romanticized, because that's the old romanticization pronunciation of it. And I have a rough idea in my head of what it should be, but I don't want to do it myself, because I said I'm uninterested. It's a Chinese history is kind of like Roman history for me. It's where I go when I want to turn my mind off a little bit and just enjoy history and not look at it and think, do I need to write a journal article about this? Anyway, he was the Song Secretary of State. Broadly speaking, that seems to be what his title translates as. And he carried the child Emperor Tipeng to Yanshen in Kuantang, would eventually, when all was lost, would jump into the sea and commit suicide with him on his back after entreating his family to do thusly. Very, very loyal minister. And there is also this general called Pu Shang, who is the great merchant ruler of Guangzhou, who's an interesting gentleman. They are fleeing from the Yuan forces, the Kublai Khan's army, and they're approaching Guangzhou, and they're on their Guangdong, Guangzhou, and they are approaching it, and they're on their ships. And basically, they've got messages going backwards and forwards with Pu Shang. They're trying to get ships off him and hire them, and he's going, "Oh, no, come into Guangzhou, I will protect you. Come into Guangzhou, I will protect you." And Zhang Shiji doesn't trust him. Others seem to think, oh, yes, he's loyal, but Zhang Shiji just goes, nope. And then he gets reports that Pu had already been talking with the Yuan forces, and so they don't. And well, finally, they don't go ashore, but they keep requesting the ships, and eventually he refuses their request, which prompts Zhang to confiscate his properties and steal his ships, as many as he could. And basically he puts everyone he can aboard the ships, because his idea is this: if he keeps them at sea and keeps them mobile, he can keep them safe. If they're mobile, if they're at sea, they are safe. If they're ashore, then the large Yuan army can catch them up. But they're at sea, they are good at sailing. They are good naval officers. At this point, Pu actually, slaughters many Imperial clan members and many officials in Guangzhou and surrenders it to Yuan and supports Yuan, which he already seemed to be arranging to do. He seemed to be arranging potentially to hand over the boy emperor, because by this point the emperor is a boy. And there is a reason the emperor is a boy, because the actual emperor they left behind when they fled the capital. Emperor Gong got forgotten. There are various stories about it, but somehow the court, the imperial court, the officials, everyone managed to leave the capital city to flee the forces of Kublai Khan and forgot to take the emperor with them. Or the emperor was overlooked, or the emperor was left behind on purpose. There are many, many debates as to why and how this happened. But the long and short of it is, he gets left behind, and they then have to go for his younger brothers. First one, then he drowns, and then they're on to the second younger brother, even younger brother, by the point it gets to the Battle of Yamen. So, yeah, it's fun. The whole point is, by 1276, when they flee Linan, which is 3 years before the battle, honestly, the Song are in trouble. The Song are in serious trouble. Their whole system has broken down. And it's broken down by years and years of attempts to walk that fine line between having an effective military and being able to afford to pay for an effective military, whilst also not having that effective military run everything and take over. It's a precipice. Surprisingly enough, the Khan was actually very, very tender and kind to Emperor Gong. When you consider how he treated other families and other ruling families when he took over, he was particularly brutal to them as a rule, but the Song get treated well. The women of the royal house are married to artisans, Han artisans. And everything's done very nicely, very properly. He uses quite a lot of their civil servants to run his government. That might explain why he treats them so. Because if he kills them and desecrates them, that's going to destroy their system and make it look bad. Whereas if he goes, you're just all children, you can't run an empire. Go away, be a noble and be junior, and let the adults run an empire. And goes, oh, but but the thing is, your forebears came up with these very good ideas of these systems, and I want to use these civil servants to run my empire. It works. But that's also one of the reasons why the Khan's winning. It's kind of like the story of the founding of the Song themselves. Children can't run the system. Adults take over. That is also the problem for the Song. They have had a long period without a... Okay, so an emperor can afford to not be necessarily a great general, as long as they can do the grand strategy. Please see the earlier video from this week about grand strategy to understand what I'm saying. And they need to have good advisors and be working with them. If with the Song, they have got progressively worse at the grand strategy as during the last century of their dynasty, and progressively worse is being kind and charitable about it. They've got progressively less and less capable of actually delivering and thinking it through. And they aren't good at the fighting either by this point. The people who founded the Song dynasty were very good at both. So imagine they're fleeing through China and eventually they get to Guangzhou and they get everyone put on a fleet. They have some of their own ships. What happens? Well, they get caught up with in Yamen, which is off the coast. Actually, if you look it up, it's a fairly nice area, but today it is more famous in terms of its area for what is slightly further, up the coast, Macau, and of course there's Yamen to its north, and Hong Kong further along. So we are talking quite a well-known area of China, but very much a part of the sea, and on the South China Seas area. It's a really, really beautiful place to go and visit. I have a friend who went there, must be about 5-6 years ago, because they were interested in this history as well, and they brought me back some pictures. I haven't managed to put those into the slides because I couldn't get contacted in time to get permission to put them up in the slides, but they've got some beautiful pictures of the area. Now, the battle starts off with Zhang Hongfang basically starting to lay siege to this fleet in the bay. He is reinforced. And he is strengthened. And he's capable of going, he's managing to sort of surround them. Zhang Shi seems to turn down the suggestion of trying to secure the mouth of the bay. This would have secured their line of retreat to the west, because he's worried that it might cause the navy to flee from the battle and leave behind the civilians. He then ordered the burning of all the palaces, houses and forts on land for the same reason. He chains the ships of the Song fleet together, roughly about 1,000 ships, forming a long string within the bay, placing Zhao Bing, the emperor, the child emperor at this point, boat in the center of his fleet. This was again done to prevent individual Song ships from fleeing the battle, but also, if we consider chaining ships together has been a policy done a lot in history. There is often a policy in certain areas of using that tactic to strengthen your fleet. But there again, the Battle of Slees would suggest that chaining your fleet together is not a necessarily great idea. Just saying that many people are having similar ideas at the same time, and they do seem to, as a rule, not work out that well. I understand why they're having the ideas, and on a limited scale it does seem to work, but when you're talking about a large battle, things tend to happen to go badly. Now, the Yuan forces then steered fire ships into the Song formation, but the Song ships had actually prepared for this. They had put a mud
fire-resistant sort of mud paint, clay paint on top of their hulls to make them capable of taking the fire ships and survive, and basically being able to hold it off before starting burn. Something which would have been really useful in European combat. I mean, literally, there are lots of European navies which would love that, but it doesn't seem to be something you can readily and easily produce if you're not hanging around near shore. So maybe something more for the Dutch. Now, the UN Navy, as mentioned, blockaded the bay, and their army cut off Song's freshwater and food sources on land. As a result, the Song very quickly run out of supplies. Basically, they've been caught, and they can't get away. The Song soldiers were forced to eat dry foods and drink seawater, which have the unsurprising effects of causing nausea and vomiting. Zhang Hongfang even managed to kidnap Zhang Xiji's nephew to use him as an intermediary to try and ask Zhang Xiji to surrender. 3 occasions, but to no avail. In the afternoon of the 18th of March, Zhang Hongfang prepared for a massive assault, and he decided to not employ cannons because he wanted the chains to hold, and he felt cannons would break the chains too effectively. Thinking about that, deciding not to use cannons because they'd be too effective for what he wants to do. This is someone preparing to deal a decisive blow. On the 19th, Zhang split his forces. Zhang Hongfang, should just call one Hongfang and one Shiji just to make life easy, but I'm going to do their full names. Split his naval forces into 4 parts, 1 each for the Song's east, north, and south sides, while the remaining portion were on his personal command and held a little bit away from the Song forces. First off, the northern flank engaged the Song forces. They were repulsed, but they kept on engaging. The Yuan then began playing festive music. This was to try and lure the Song into thinking that the Yan forces were having a banquet and lowering their guard. At noon, Zhang Hongfang attacked from the front, hiding additional soldiers under large pieces of cloth. Once Zhang Hongfang's boats neared the Song fleet, the Yuan sounded the horn of battle, and the soldiers were revealed under the fabric. So you think you've got minimal forces coming towards you, and then you suddenly got lots of forces coming towards you. It's psychological warfare. Remember, these are people who have been having nausea, vomiting, probably not sleeping well, hungry, irritable. Yeah, they're living on their nerves. The Song troops had prepared, it seems, for a small skirmish, but I actually think, honestly, they just didn't have that many troops available by this point in that place. They were moving them up and down, and moving them around, and they moved them already all the way down to deal with the earlier battle. There's going to be casualties they're dealing with. There's going to be the fact they're going to be tired after that. I don't think it's that they were prepared for a small skirmish because they only saw boats with cloths coming on. I think that's probably all they had available. It's a nice idea to believe that they've been conned in. It sounds good for you as the Yuan when you're studying the story, but in reality, it's probably not the case. Waves of arrows hit the Song ships, and the Song fleet lost quickly 7 ships and a large number of troops in the process. So again, to me, that suggests that the fact that a large number of troops are lost suggests that those troops were rushing rather than being in positions where they were protected behind the ships have castles and forts. Think something like almost a cog scenario, as the British, and European wars as cog with those sort of the castle formations added on at either end, towers, etc. they, instead of them being in a position ready, they're still having to get themselves going and trying to rush to posts, and because they're so tired, and they get caught. And then it goes further, and some sources go further and say the Song troops who were found were ill and weakened and were no match for the Yuan troops in close combat. And combined with this, you have the fact that the chaining together means the Song ships can neither support in the middle or retreat, and the chain of command, battle command, doesn't work at all because it's so confused and chaotic. Once the troops were killed, the slaughter of the court began. And this is very contradictory to how Gong was treated. Gong had been made a noble and looked after, etc. He'd been, all sorts of things very nicely for him. But now, these were the courts. These were the holdouts, the people who kept fighting. These are treated like the Kublai Khan normally treats people. They're killed. Seeing the battle was lost, Zhang Shi picked out his finest soldiers, cut about a dozen ships from the formation, in an attempt to break out and save the emperor. Now, here is when you have another name for this gentleman earlier, who I call Secretary of State, but some people call Prime Minister. I think Secretary of State is more likely sort of role. Li Zifu, and Grand Chancellor of the Song Dynasty is another phrase used, another description given of his title, which again is more accurate to in my mind than Prime Minister. But Secretary of State seems to be more what I would call him in British context. Again, some of the times the translations between the English and the Chinese and English are done by especially German historians who are very keen on it. But the trouble is, then they use when they're translating, because when you're translating, you're often not going for exact words, you're using context and similarities. They'll use the German sounding phrases, the German phraseology, chancellor, etc. Whereas the British might use Prime Minister or Secretary of State. Now, he, of course, as mentioned earlier, jumps into the sea with the boy emperor. Both are drowned. Many officials and concubines followed suit, apparently. The history of the song, which is one of those, one of the official Chinese historical works, records that 7 days after the battle, thousands of corpses floated to the surface of the sea, which is pretty much accurate of what happens. And the body of the boy emperor was found near Shenku in Shenzhen. We've never found his actual grave, and this is just a report. Zhang Ji, after escaping the battle, tried to get Dowager Yang to appoint the next, that's the boy emperor's mother. From memory correctly, yeah, that's the mother. Is that the mother or the grandmother? I think it's the mother. But she'd also committed suicide at sea after hearing of her son/grandson's death, and Zhang Shi buried her at the shore. As mentioned earlier, Zhao Bing was the last Song emperor. Yeah. Kublai Khan takes over. And they have memorials, etc., to him, and there is a lot of history put forward because of that. It is considered one of the largest naval battles in history. It's also one of the more interesting naval battles in history, and I say that not out of particular love for this battle, but because what we know about it and what we can draw an inference from it, from the technology they had available, the personalities we know, knowledge we have about the personalities involved, and the geography of where they chose. It is a battle dictated by things which do not often dictate a naval battle. Its closest approximation is not Trafalgar or Midway, but probably the convoy battles of the Mediterranean, where the warships are tied in place by the merchant vessels they're protecting, and the enemy is chucking everything at them. This is not the convoy battle of the Atlantic, where you might occasionally see an aircraft and your main threat is just the submarines. No, this was everything, and the kitchen sink. And there is no friendly territory. You're not going from, you are surrounded by your enemy. Whereas in the Battle Atlantic, you can say you're both surrounded by the sea, not your enemy. Neither side surrounds each other, really, in the Battle Atlantic. In the Battle Mediterranean, yeah, those convoys are surrounded. A lesson? Ultimately, the lesson is running a country is hard. Getting the balance right is difficult. And when you're playing, I would argue, when you're playing games like Crusader Kings and those sort of things, especially Crusader Kings 3, which a friend of mine, Gareth the Brit, plays a lot of and does very well on Twitch and things like that. He uses this phrase: it's not an empire game, it's a dynasty game. And you have to set up the dynasty. And that's the scenario you're dealing with. You're playing the grand game, you're doing grand strategy, but it's on a dynasty level. And you can have absolutely great people in that dynasty, who will be amazing leaders and able to play that game like it's... But occasionally you'll have people who just can't, who are useless, but they're in post because of who put them in post. And occasionally you'll have kids, and they're useless because they're kids. Not because they're bad or they couldn't become great when they're older. They're kids, so no one listens to them. At one point, the Song are ruled at the end by two dowagers. They have the two dowager empresses are basically acting as regents for the boy emperor. And again, they're trying, but that's going to create so many issues. It'd be almost better if one of them did a Catherine the Great and just basically said, I'm in charge. Try and argue with me. So, today's question. Thank you for watching. How have you liked having a premiere? No, seriously, that's part of the question. But the serious question is going to be, what have you heard about Chinese ships in the Age of Sail? What have you heard about their sizes? What do you think about them? Does anything about them interest you? Would you like me to go digging around and spending a lot of patron money to try and find decent books about it? Because trust me, the books on Chinese history and English language are extortionate. They're lovely, but they are extortionate. So, we've got blockading Brest on Thursday, and yeah, gonna be a good week. And we've got nuclear power on Tuesday. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you as ever to all my patrons, all my subscribers, all the members of the channel, all the people who support the channel and make it actually viable for me to do. Thank you very much, and it is now 2:30 in the morning on the 19th of March, and I am officially in trouble. Take care.